You Great. And so I'll just introduce myself. My name is Brett Webster. I am with RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute. RMI is an independent nonprofit with a mission to accelerate the clean energy transition. We are a global organization of over 700 researchers, analysts, and energy experts working to decarbonize the four sectors listed on the slide there. We have done a lot of work in Massachusetts over the years. It has recently included efforts to scale up deep energy retrofits for affordable housing and some work on non-pipeline alternatives and gas transition planning, which has been in partnership with National Grid. We are serving as part of the consultant team selected by Mass CEC for this grid services work. And our primary role is supporting Energy and Environmental Economics, or E3, who is leading the work with stakeholder engagement and implementation scope. So yeah, nice to meet you all, and you could move on to the next slide. Our objectives for this workshop here today are to build a foundational understanding and vision for grid services in Massachusetts. We aim to share the motivations, goals, and intended approach for establishing a compensation mechanism for the value that DERs can provide, especially to the distribution system. We'd like to align on the role of stakeholder engagement throughout this work. And we'd like to begin to solicit input and feedback from you all on your priorities and concerns related to the work, and then feedback on the proposed approach and methods. And there will be a variety of avenues to collect this feedback, which I will get into momentarily. So next slide, please. Our agenda today in service of those objectives are, we will open up here with a few introductory slides presented by Mass CEC to develop some context and background on this study and the workshop series. We'll then have a joint presentation from the Massachusetts electric distribution companies explaining their grid services proposals and how this work dovetails with those. We will then turn it to E3 to discuss the study objectives and proposed approach. We will have opportunities for clarifying questions throughout, but then after E3's presentation of the approach, we will have a dedicated window for stakeholder input, where we will open up and ask some more probing questions and really welcome your thoughts and feedback there, especially if there's questions that we weren't able to get to earlier. We will then wrap up and have some closing. And so our aim is to keep this agenda to 2 hours. It's possible we will spill a bit over that, but noting that the meeting invite for today is for 3 hours. And so if there are discussion or feedback or items that folks want to dig into that we're not able to cover in this 2-hour window, we welcome folks to stay on. And I think much of the project team is available the full 3 hours. Next slide, please. Some of the ground rules for the workshop today: we'd like to ask folks to mute yourself when you're not speaking. We suggest minimizing distractions, so silencing or turning off your cell phones during the workshop to have as much engagement as possible. We welcome questions to be posted in the chat as we go along. And you are also welcome to use the raise hand function that's in the bottom menu of the Zoom screen for any questions during the Q&A breaks. We will have, as I mentioned, some brief pauses for Q&A and then a dedicated window for more probing questions. And we'd like to ask folks to identify yourself as you're speaking or commenting in the chat, just so we can track the organizations and communities that are being represented by the input that we receive. Next slide, please. And then this is the first in a series of 4 workshops related to this work. So future meeting announcements will be sent out by email to the workshop mailing list There is a link on this slide to join that mailing list. So if you're not on it, encourage you to sign up there. The workshop slides and recording will be made available on the Mass CEC website, linked there. And then we welcome any questions or feedback after the meeting via email with the email addresses listed on the slide. And then there will also be a form sent out to participants of the workshop specifically to collect feedback. So that's a fourth avenue that we look forward to engaging with you all related to this work. And with that, I will pass it to Mass CEC to provide some more introductory comments.
All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Sarah Cullinan, and I direct our Net Zero Grid program here at Mass CEC. Mass CEC is the clean energy economic development arm of the Massachusetts state government. Mass CEC is focused on strengthening and supporting the Massachusetts economy by catalyzing the innovation that's needed to meet the state's ambitious 2050 climate goals. More specifically, my Net Zero Grid team is focused on fostering innovation in the grid for the energy transition. As most of us are probably aware, the grid will be our platform for decarbonization. And there are a lot of changes that are needed for it to get there, to be that platform. So for a successful grid transition, we'll need a lot of new technology. We'll need new ways of working. We'll need new business models, new programs, all of those things to help get us there. So as part of my team's work, we see earlier and deeper collaboration with our utilities and other grid-facing stakeholders, such as yourselves, as being very critical for the grid's transition, particularly when we're navigating innovative ideas and models like this work. So this project is one example of doing that. Mass CEC convened this collaborative group for this study. We are all, everyone listed on the slide, working in close partnership on this work. So I'll just run through the organizations. We have my team, the Net Zero Grid team. We have representatives from 2 Massachusetts state agencies, the Department of Energy Resources and the Attorney General's Office, the Office of the Ratepayer Advocate. And we have representatives from each of our investor-owned utilities, Eversource, Unitil, and National Grid. The EDCs, for some additional context, the EDCs, any kind of formal program coming out of this would be proposed by the EDCs to the Department of Public Utilities. This concept was included in their electric sector modernization plans, and the concept and some enabling funding was approved by the department in that order. We'll hear a little bit more about that in a bit from our EDCs. Next slide, please. So what are DERs? This is starting in a very basic place, but we want to recognize that not everyone is coming from the same background here. And even for those of you who may be deeply familiar with DERs, you'll probably appreciate that DER can have several definitions. So this is ours. So our definition of DERs is technologies connected to the distribution grid, which can generate electricity or reduce or shift grid loads. The DERs that we're considering include energy efficiency, demand response, distributed solar PV, distributed energy storage, and electrification loads such as EVs and heat pumps. So you can think of DERs for these purposes that we'll be talking about as thousands or soon to be millions of interactive nodes on the grid. They have the capability of pulling or pushing or modulating electricity. Next slide. All right, so this is called a grid services study, but what are grid services? So DERs can support and even supplement certain distribution grid functions. For example, solar can generate electricity and can reduce loads if it's rooftop. Batteries and demand response, for example, can participate in shifting loads. So by doing those things, DERs can reduce the cost of building and operating the grid. They can take some of the strain off of the grid. And by doing that, the utilization of DERs and their inherent flexibility can save ratepayers money. We'll start to call those things deferred and avoided costs. We'll get more into that. DERs also have other benefits that don't have a clear monetary ratepayer cost, but they are still real societal benefits. We will also be considering those, and those we'll start to call non-rate impacts. So we know that DERs and their flexibility is valuable, but we need to know how to unlock it and how to harness it. And this study is one piece of that puzzle. Specifically, this study is looking at the ways we need to compensate DERs for their grid responsiveness. It's not just about fairness in compensating them, it's also about ensuring their reliability of response and to communicate the value that a DER can provide at a specific place and at a specific time. So that compensation piece is what this study is all about, or primarily about, at least. And finally, before I hand it off to the EDCs, it's important to note that we're focused specifically on the distribution system side of things. So benefits to the distribution system, not yet the transmission system. And that will also be explained more as we go. So hopefully this provided some initial context. There's plenty more to dig into. I'll hand it over to our EDCs to talk more about their perspective of grid services and what they have in their ESMPs.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Can you hear me, Sarah? Give me a thumbs up or a yes.
Yes.
Great. Lovely. And apologies, I'm not joining via video. My laptop is giving me a little bit of trouble. My name is Gideon Banner. I'm with National Grid. We and Eversource will be presenting the following 3 slides, and you can move forward. Is it Brett? I'm not sure who's doing this, but thank you. So just to start with this, some of you may be familiar with the EDC's Electric Sector Modernization Plans, also known as the ESMPs. These are also, somewhat a little confusingly, often referred to as the Future Grid Plans. These are plans that were approved. Each of the EDCs filed an ESMP back in January. In August, they were approved as strategic plans by the Massachusetts DPU. And what they are, in broad strokes, they are long-term, as you can see on the screen in front of you, long-term strategic plans to safely deliver an electric distribution system that can support Massachusetts net zero by 2050 vision. In particular, and I'm skipping a bullet here, in particular, they really aim to do so by facilitating the build out of the electric distribution system so as to enable electrification and DER growth, right? The growing amounts of electrification that we all, I think, know and expect will be happening in future years. Skipping back up on your screen, each of those ESMPs includes 5 years of investments beginning in July of next year of 2025. Originally, that date was January of 2025. That date was pushed out 6 months by the DPU. And one other thing, as you can see on your screen, that is common to all EDCs, ESMPs, is that they aim to make it easier for customers to participate in the clean energy transition. And then lastly, and this is really what the crux of what the importance of the ESMPs to the discussion today. We as the EDCs we're not starting from a blank slate here. We have done quite a bit of thinking about grid services and non-wireless alternatives and virtual power plants. And a lot of that thinking, our approaches are included in our ESMPs. That approach, generally across the ESMPs, that approach aims to operationalize customer-sited flexibility and to maximize the value of that flexibility to the distribution grid. One common proposal in all ESMPs is what are called the grid service compensation funds. These aim to, among other things, provide customer incentives for new local, and I'm highlighting the term local on purpose, new local distribution grid service programs and market approaches. The reason I'm highlighting the word local is because not necessarily looking at system-wide grid services, such as those provided by Massachusetts Connected Solutions programs, right? Those programs, in broad strokes, aim to avoid peak system-wide across the grid, the distribution and transmission. What we're really talking about here today is those local grid services. Last thing I'll call attention to regarding the ESMPs is that they also aim to enable technology investments that are really necessary to unlock that flexibility, to provide our grid operators and planners with the tools they need to reliably manage those customer-sited DERs. Last thing I'll call out before we jump forward is just that those ESMPs are rather long, if any, for those of you who may have taken a look at them. And although we've aimed to make them reader friendly and easily digestible, they're nevertheless they're large documents. So in order to call out the sections of the ESMPs where we've described our approach to grid services, we will be sending out, I believe by end of day tomorrow, either page references so that, if you wish, you can go into those ESMPs and see in more detail what I've just spoken about. We may even send concentrated excerpts from those plans as well, from the ESMPs. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Eli.
Great. Thank you, Gideon. Eli Shacken, also from National Grid. So Gideon, I thought, did a great job of just introducing the ESMPs more broadly, and that the orange highlighted bullet around the grid service compensation funds and the ways in which we're really looking to, in this ESMP period, explore ways to further integrate customer flexibility into the way that we plan and operate our distribution networks, so that it can really be a complementary lever to the physical network investments that we make on our system, and that we're maximizing the value of flexibility, we're maximizing the value of our physical network investments. But in order to do that, as Gideon outlined as well, there's quite a bit that needs to come into place. So over this ESMP term, we plan to really explore what it takes to be able to use customer-cited flexibility to address specific constraints on the distribution network. So this is a novel use case for us in Massachusetts. We don't have, I don't think we have any real examples of doing this where we're leveraging customer resources to address a specific, the deferral of a specific substation project or a specific feeder project. So the types of projects that are comprising the majority of the investments included in our ESMP. So we're really excited to be working on this study and collaborating with you all as stakeholders and the team, the core team of folks involved in the grid services study, to help us be able to do that. So what we're really looking for from this study is some input from the project team and from the stakeholders to really help us be able to understand what compensation framework should look like for future programs, future distribution grid service programs that help us to address specific network constraints on our system. So that starts with, as Jen will cover in the next slide, we've identified a few different types of distribution grid services that we're really trying to understand and build programmatic approaches around. But the first step starts with really being able to understand what is the value of deferring or providing a specific grid service in a specific location. So the first thing that we're looking for is some help from this effort to really help us have a unified way to think about what those values are and be able to calculate what a value should be in a specific location. The next two pieces are really around taking that value and figuring out ways to start to design compensation programs for customers to provide that value and to receive compensation for the services that they provide to the distribution grid. As we start to work through what that looks like, we recognize that a big piece of this project, if implemented effectively, is we want to be able to see this roadmap of maybe the short-term things that we are able to do maybe very soon when it comes to local distribution grid service programs, to maybe what it looks like, in the future, once certain like signposts are achieved or certain capabilities fall into place. Over the course of this like 5-year ESMP term in particular, this is something that Gideon mentioned, like all the EDCs will be deploying like new technology on their distribution systems, including DERMS, which over time will really change the way that we're able to contract with and manage flexibility on our network. So as our capabilities evolve, we expect that the way that these compensation programs work and how precise and granular we can be to really sort of get at like specific grid use cases, we expect those to evolve as well. So I will pause there and hand it over to Jen from Eversource, who will take the next slide.
Great, thanks, Eli. So, we've talked a little bit about the, kind of what is a grid service, and Sarah talked about that. And, I think as Eli and Gideon explained, we at the electric distribution companies have spent, a fair amount of time trying to think about how could this work practically. And so what we wanted to do was just share a little bit about kind of how, just to ground us all on the logistics of where these opportunities are. So I'm going to direct your attention to the right-hand side of the screen here. And if you start at the top, you think there's a local grid constraint. And I saw in the chat, somebody asked, what is the definition of local? The local is where there is a constraint, a need. So we may, as we speak, talk about a substation. A substation is a set of infrastructure that is critical to taking power from the transmission system to the distribution system. Some of that equipment may be, if there's more load, the equipment may not be able to handle all of the load. So that may necessitate an upgrade to that substation. So we'll call that the local grid constraint. It's a place where with electrification, with solar, there's just too much load going through the equipment and we're risking an overload. So that's the local constraint. So we go from number one. In our control rooms at our EDCs, we have folks who sit in the control center and who we are monitoring the grid all the time, 24/7, to make sure power is flowing. So they may see this potential constraint. Load is growing and it looks like it might get over the rating of a piece of equipment. So that's what those folks in the control room do. They say, we got a situation here. And then, Eli mentioned technology. We're building out DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management System, other technologies to have better visibility of what's going on in the grid. And let's say in this future world, we say, okay, well, connected to that substation is, batteries, demand response, any kind of distributed energy resource that we could call upon to lower load at that time to make it such that the constraint is alleviated. So if the EDC can send a signal to the grid asset then responds, the control room sees the response in the local grid constraint. So load is down and we're no longer at risk of an overload. So that's kind of the logistics from a high level of how it would work. Obviously, there's a lot, and what we're trying to do in this study is to get at the details of how we recognize that what kind of assets and how these assets can provide value, and then to think about, if I'm going to dispatch, I'm going to lower somebody's load, a demand response, I need to compensate them for that. And that's what this study is to let's look at and try and see how we can come up with frameworks that are help to guide us to know what is a fair compensation. So those are the logistics. On the left-hand side, we've identified a few sources of value, and we'll get more into that as this process continues. But when you think about the first one, we call it bridge to wires. In my example of the substation, that constraint exists in my example exists in real time, and I don't have time to go out and build a new addition to my substation. So I need this right now. So this is a bridge to wires is a solution that I can implement right away. I can reduce load, and that can make it so that I'm not worried about these kind of real-term near constraints. in the longer term, in our electric sector modernization plans, we've thought about, thinking about the 2050 decarbonization goals. And Sarah talked about, the net zero grid. To enable the net zero grid, there's going to be a lot more electric power flow on the system. So if I think longer term and I say, well, my longer term plan is to upgrade this feeder, is there a possibility that with these resources that our control rooms can call upon, maybe I don't need to upgrade that as soon as I thought I did? Maybe I can defer that a little bit, or maybe even avoid it. And those are the kind of things that create cost savings for all customers, because if it's avoiding a cost that we would have to otherwise incur, and we have the ability to use more cost-effective resources to address it. So that's a deferral. And then the last is operational flexibility. Again, those two prior examples are very local, right? In a situation like in Natick, I have an issue, and right there at that Natick substation, I have to solve it. That doesn't mean that same constraint exists in Springfield, Massachusetts, right? But operational flexibility is something that may exist more broadly, but is in response to a local condition. So if a car hits a pole and I have an immediate reliability concern, maybe there's some value to dispatching resources. So it's a local issue, but it may arise in any place on the grid, depending on how things go. Or maybe voltage management, there may be an opportunity to dispatch resources for improved voltage management. So that at a high level is some of the things that we're hoping to discuss as a part of the study is, how the logistics would work, and how this level of communication and control and compensation can help us to save costs for customers across the Commonwealth. I'm going to stop there. That's the material we had for the EDC presentation. I believe I'm handing it back to Andrew or Brett at this point.
Yeah, I think we'll pass it along to Andrew de Benedictis in a moment. I do want to just open, as we mentioned, we'd have time for a few questions during the middle of presentations. We don't want to take too much time on this, but since we're a tiny bit ahead of schedule, if there's any clarifying questions at the moment, we can take those just briefly. And I apologize, I can't see the chat, so if there's anything else coming up, just let me know. We'll also continue to try to answer any questions through the chat as we move through the presentation, if you have any that can't wait.
I was going to say, Jen, there is a question in the chat that you might be able to speak to about deferred versus avoided. So do the utilities consider potential substitution of traditional poles and wires as a possibility for grid services? Is the difference or the role of avoided costs?
Yeah, no, I think we're looking for all cost-effective solutions. So if you think about in my substation example, if my equipment can handle, let's say, 50 megawatts, and I can always keep it below 50, if all of the resources on the system, if my ability to dispatch those things always keeps it below 50, I don't need to build anything new, and that would be a completely avoided cost. If load is expected to increase over time, and I can keep it below 50 for maybe 3 more years, but then in year 4 I get above 50, that's where I need to solve a problem. So our goal is to keep it as long as possible, and that may be forever, but we are in a period of load growth, and that's where we need to, as we plan the system, we need to be able to accommodate if more people get electric vehicles, if more people get heat pumps. If I can't keep up with the other resources, that's where I'm going to have to look at the more traditional solution as well. Does that answer the question? Maybe Eli, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, the only thing that was an excellent answer, Jen. I agree with everything you said. The only thing maybe I'll add as well is, like, sometimes you can only defer long enough until, like, your next constraint is that there's an asset condition issue, and you need to replace a substation or a feeder because it's been degraded, a certain amount of time. So eventually, like, there's probably some physical infrastructure project that has to happen at some point. But I agree with everything that Jen said. Like if we are effective at managing load in certain ways, then we can avoid the need for like system capacity related like upgrades that are driven by load growth.
Thank you both. And I think there might be one hand raised. I can't see the name anymore, but
Hi there, it's MK from New Leaf Energy. I just wanted to ask a question about timing, as in bridge to wires. If you identify that a solution is required, that can be a non-traditional solution, what would be like the timeline for implementation of that? And then what would you say is the same for deferral? It seems like deferral, you are still noticing that there will be overloads, but maybe perhaps they're not immediate. I'm having trouble understanding immediate versus in 2050, or is it 2030, or is it 2040? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that question. And these are some of the details that we're all going to need to get into. And they're, you know, that they make this kind of an interesting intellectual issue. Because yes, so in my example with the 50 megawatts, if I'm worried that I'm going to, you know, this summer I'm going to be over 50, you know, with the load is higher in the summer, and I'm worried this summer, like I don't have enough time to build much of anything traditionally. Like I really need it right now because I'm worried that something will happen. And my alternative to that, I might have to roll a generator. I might have to put the system in a little bit more of a risky configuration. Like I'm gonna have to address it in the near term. So bridge to wires has that kind of that sense of immediacy, where if I don't have this, I'm going to have to do something else that is going to address it in a, you know, in a costly or maybe more risky way. The deferral / avoidance, those are now in our ESMPs. We've made 10-year plans, and we've identified needs that are out into the 10-year time horizon, and even beyond. You know, we kind of have a look forward to say, where do we think these constraints are going to happen? Where are electric vehicles going to show up? Where are heat pumps going to show up? Where is the existing infrastructure stressed such that it's not, you know, that we plan that if load grows the way we think it will, we will need to build something. So that timing just depends on, in my 50 megawatt example, maybe it's out 4 years, maybe it's out 7 years, you know, it depends on the location, the pace of the load growth, and the ratings of the existing equipment. So it's very local. So I think that's why this problem becomes challenging, because it is very project driven. It's saying, you know, here's a specific need for a specific piece of infrastructure in a specific location, and that's where the timing is going to vary based on your what the circumstances are in that exact location.
Got it. It does. The reason I asked the question in the first place is to sort of also provide some input on that. As in, from a developer perspective, we would want to. It's one. Our interest depends on how quickly we can participate in some of these programs. So it's important to perhaps have some framework around that, and not have maybe the same upgrade that you're going to see in 4 years be clubbed into the deferral program as the one that you will see in 10 years. It's sort of helpful to have a timeline framework within these subcategories that you have.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you for that. And I don't mean to jump ahead too much, but timing is something we really would benefit from some stakeholder feedback on, because the certainty that like in your example, a developer may need to say, hey, I'm going to work on a project here because this is a specifically valuable location to put my DER. And so, but how much time do you need in advance to know the thing is coming, right? Like, and then for how long? Now, let's say we say, hey, there's going to be a need here in 5 years. So that gives you plenty of time. You build something, but then so do a bunch of other people, and my need was maybe of over 50 was maybe 2, and now I have more than 2. So some of the timing issues are things that that this framework can discuss, and so we're very interested in getting stakeholder feedback on kind of the value of knowing certainty and timing.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks both for the questions and input. We'll move along now. We'll then have kind of our next session at the end of, we'll have a chance for broader input, a full half hour to have time from and hear from other participants. So if you have questions in the meantime as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat, and then we'll come back to address them in that longer session as well. Now we're going to move on to the study objectives broadly.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So hi everyone, my name is Andrew D. Benedictus. I'm a director with E3, and as the first E3 speaker on the mic for more than just a minute at a time, I get the pleasure of introducing the company to you all. So we are a consulting firm focused on the clean energy transition, with offices across the US and Canada, and somewhere north of 130 full-time consultants working on this problem. One thing that we really pride ourselves on and that we think is really valuable is that we tend to split our work, which is something like 250 projects a year, across the different points of view of the industry. So we do, roughly about a third of our work with utilities and system operators, about a third with the public sector, so regulators, nonprofits, etc., and then about a third with investors, developers, groups like that. And for us, this is really valuable because it gives us a really comprehensive view of not just the energy system, but the unique challenges that sort of each of these different groups has in mind, and that they bring to the table, as we try to advance the energy transition. And so, in our eyes, this allows us to kind of always have these different points of view in mind, regardless of which particular client we're working with at that time, and to bring solutions to the table that sort of work for everyone who's involved in the transition, everyone who's working at this all together. On the bottom right-hand side of the slide, you'll see some examples of recent work we've done relevant to this. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I'll note that for folks following the work the Interagency Rates Working Group is doing, that's a piece that we're involved in. We were behind the Charging Forward report that came out last year around the same time. And then across the country, we've been involved in similar efforts to start to put sort of a more spatially and temporally granular point on how we're valuing DER contributions to the grid. So we've been working on this in California, in New York, not listed here, but also sort of ongoing work in Illinois on that front too. So excited to bring that experience here to Massachusetts, but also to understand all the things that are sort of uniquely Massachusetts about this, and make sure, especially as we get to these like really spatially granular considerations, there's certainly no cookie cutter solution here. Moving on to the next slide, we'll just do a quick team introduction. I'm not going to read through all the names here, but folks have already heard from Brett over on the RMI advisory team. We also have Kara Goldenberg, not available to join us today, but on that team as well. And then on the E3 side, we've got sort of our leadership crew at the top there. You'll hear from me today, as well as Andrew Solfest, our project manager, and a really excellent team of analysts working with us. Moving on from there, we can get into a little bit of like the why and the how here. I think we've hinted at a lot of this discussion already, so hopefully these ideas aren't too new coming from me right now. But you know, I think this slide actually captures a lot. We could talk about this for a long time, but I'll say it quickly. Just the electric grid continues to evolve rapidly. You know, we're sort of coming from an age of really top-down grid management, right? Where we had just power plants and the lines got to get smaller and smaller as you got closer and closer to load. You know, the dynamic there is really changing with so much electrification, with so much DER penetration coming in, that we need to think about the grid not just on this like singular, very simple sort of top-down way, but to be thinking about the grid dynamics at this much more granular level. And there's been some good discussion already in the chat I've noticed on, you know, what does sort of spatially granular mean there? Is this the substation level? Is this all the way down to the circuit level? I think that's one of the things that that first off, you know, we want to hear about how stakeholders are thinking about that. But also, I think that's a consideration that's going to change over time, because ultimately we want to do sort of the best that we can do in terms of providing value to the system. And that's going to be based on the data and the information and the level of sort of like granular control or just signal sending that we've got. And so that's something that's going to change with time, right? As data improves, as AMI gets, you know, in and fully utilized across the state. So that's something, you know, that's like a stage that we want to set now, and we want to do the best we can, but we want to keep pushing on that front also, to make sure that we're, you know, keeping up basically with the evolution of the grid there and the needs of that evolving grid. And then called out on the right hand side of the top of this is the idea, I think the folks have already mentioned, you know, the sort of existing frameworks always looked at this from that more from that more like top down sort of like regional value, as we think about the connected solution signal being based on, you know, the ISO New England peak, and not, you know, based on individual distribution feeder peaks or something like that. So there's obviously some alignment there, right? There are going to be some feeders that are well aligned with that, others less well aligned with that, and so we can't really know what that level of alignment or misalignment is until we start to get down into the data. But we know that it's not perfectly aligned, and so we know that there's a need to focus more on the distribution grid if we want to provide real sort of actionable value there. And that gets us to the framework that we want to be working on here, and sort of two key priorities of this framework. We want it to be actionable in the near term. We want it to be something that that we can do now with the data that we have now, with the technology that we have now, so that we're not waiting around and possibly causing bottlenecks in terms of interconnection, or leading to investment that might be otherwise avoidable. So we want this to be actionable now, but we need it to be adaptable, as I've already hinted at, right? This is a problem that's going to keep evolving, and our ability to address this problem is going to keep evolving. And so we want whatever framework we define now to be something, right, that's really adaptable, really nimble to adapt and just be ready for this future as it comes towards us. We can go to the next slide here. So in terms of getting to that sort of lofty goal, we've got a few key objectives here that I'll read through in short form. This is really starting to get to like the specific how of it, right? So getting away from the vision a little bit and down into the specifics of what are we actually going to be doing in this study. And this should all be pretty in line with what we've said so far, so I don't think there'll be any big surprises here. But first and foremost, we need to just develop a methodology and think about the data that we need coming into this methodology to be able to figure out the value provided by DERs for grid services. Beyond that, then we also want to think, you heard Sarah mention earlier, the idea of these non-rate impacts, right? So values that DERs are providing, but that aren't quantified in the utility revenue requirement. Some of those we'll be able to talk about, some of those we'll be able to put numbers to, and we want to figure out basically how and to what extent we want to incorporate those non-rate impacts, but we certainly want to be aware of them. because those are real benefits. Third on this list then gets into implementation a bit more. So thinking about grid services compensation mechanism. So you've heard folks already talk about, we need to be able to signal somehow, and I think we've already heard some discussion, connected solutions coming up, about the need for this signal to be, I think, two things. One is sort of strong enough that we get any participation, but then alongside that, we want to make sure that we're not double counting anything or sort of twice paying for the same value if we're already paying out some value through another program. So we want to be really aware of that and just make sure that we're sort of carving out a unique space for this mechanism here. Of course, throughout this, we want to make sure that we are working equity and environmental justice considerations into everything. That might be in how the compensation mechanism is set up. That might be in sort of how we're funding things. I think they're, basically throughout the process. I think at every step we want to just be making sure that we've got, our EJ communities in mind. And this is another piece. We'll sort of open up the questions for it later or comments for it later. But this is another piece where we really want to make sure that we're gathering as much, input from all of you as possible. Getting down to number 5, we then want to create a roadmap. We talked about adaptability in the last slide. So, right, this is the roadmap that says, okay, here's what we've set up for now. Here's, how this mechanism evolves in the future. Here's how it adapts to improved data. Other situations we might run into as we move forward here. And then, of course, just in 6, we want to write it down. We want to report it out. We want to have this be something that everyone's along for the ride, everybody understands, and make sure that that's all recorded. And that sort of leads us into the number 7 that we've added here too, which is also just that we want to, in the spirit of taking everybody along for the ride, we want to have plenty of opportunity for stakeholder input, right? So through these 4 workshops, through additional comments, we want to make sure that everyone feels heard and that we're able to, take in all the input from folks, sort of individual experiences and priorities in thinking about this. In terms of sort of deliverables or work products, these flow pretty directly from those steps, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but, we'll start out, we want to create our evaluation framework. This leads us to our implementation mechanism. And of course, then there's like the actually implementing it, right? Getting there with our implementation plan, and then the long-term plan also for sort of how we adapt, how we change over time. I think as illustrated here, if we almost regard this as a timeline left to right, we have to start at the top and waterfall our way down a little bit, but a lot of these, will proceed in parallel. This isn't a in-series sort of thing. So, all the thoughts that we have on the long term, on the near term, we're sort of taking all of this in the entire time because there's plenty, in terms of thinking about the long term, want to be making sure that we're taking steps in the near term that point us in that same direction, right? We don't want to go off down a bit of a tangent in the near term only to have to walk ourselves back, get stakeholders used to another form of participation or something like that. So in order to have that sort of consistency throughout the process and have our eyes on the long-term prize the whole time, there's going to be a lot of parallel thinking, parallel development as we go through this. And then the last slide that I'll share right now is just a rough timeline of our stakeholder workshop series. So here we are today, December 16th, having our sort of intro workshop. After that, we're hoping in February to hold workshop number 2, where we'll share basically the analytical approach to how we're valuing grid services. Moving from there, then in workshop 3, we'll be able to get more into the compensation side, the implementation, and thinking about the near-term plan. That'll be in the spring of 2025. Moving into workshop 4, sometime early summer. That's where we hope to share out the long-term roadmap. And then this all concludes with a final report release sometime over the summer. I'll admit right here and now, the only absolutely certain date on here is the one happening today. After that, we hope to hit sort of this rough timeline, but we also don't want to use the timeline as an excuse to like curtail any valuable discussion. So, we'll adjust these things as needed based on, how discussions are going, how we feel like we're figuring things out, and just kind of the read of the room in general. But this is, a general plan that we think feels pretty realistic in terms of giving us a chance to, get good feedback, produce good things to then share out and continue to get feedback in that sort of cycle. So that's where I'll leave things off for this section, and I will hand it to my colleague Andrew Solfest to give a bit more detail on our study approach. Initial thoughts.
Thanks, Andrew. As we move into the study approach, I'll be repeating a lot of things that we've already talked about, just the general values, and we're going to try to keep things relatively high level for this initial workshop, as we're still at the beginning stages and many of the details have yet to be ironed out, including those dates, as Andrew just mentioned. And we do want to be ironing all that out with input from all of you over the next several months. However, I do want to just at least walk through and provide a general understanding of some of the key features of the analysis as we see it today, and some of the things that we're keeping in mind as we seek to value distribution grid services and determine appropriate compensation mechanisms. So we have kind of key driving questions for the study. This is not entirely comprehensive, and it's really coming back to some of the things we've already discussed. I want to talk about what the benefits are that DERs can provide to the distribution grid. Those 3 categories that Jen had presented actually on earlier. We want to talk about how we're quantifying different types of benefits, where they can be grouped and can or should be split out separately. We want to make sure we're understanding what determines where on the grid the benefits appear, what value they provide, as well as how these benefits impact environmental justice populations potentially differently or specifically. We want to make sure we're talking about what's actually required for the utilities to be able to realize these benefits, kind of make them from concept into actual value, moving from paper to practice. And we, again, want to talk about how we want to go about compensating the benefits in terms of mechanisms as well. So first, focusing on those first 3 or 4 broad questions on the list about what the benefits are and how we quantify them. We'll start with the valuation. It's helpful to first zoom out again, and I'll do this again in a few slides, but just talk kind of broadly about what the grid is as a whole and where the value could appear in order to make sure we're concentrating on the right pieces. So as you move kind of from left to right in this graphic, you can see there's all these system-wide services. There's the energy and generation, the transmission, which are pretty broadly applicable across any utility service territory. Then as you move narrower down, you get to primary and secondary distribution. We don't need to dig into the details of those specifics right now, but basically this is how we get the energy to the end consumer. If you're in the industry, you're very familiar with these concepts likely, but if you're not, it's basically the last steps in the chain, and moving from the level of hundreds of thousands of customers down to the tens of customers potentially, focusing on those really specific distribution equipment. But each of these elements of the grid have their own values and constraints, and DERs can impact each of these to differing degrees. But for this study, we really want to home in on distribution system costs. Concerned in this with the study, and it's really about bringing energy again to the end user and how DERs might reduce some of the stress on the infrastructure involved. As has already been mentioned and a few times, these costs, the distribution system benefits, can be highly location specific. These costs are more nuanced in many ways than those system-wide costs, and speaking broadly, aren't as well captured, at least at the specific level or according to that degree of nuance, as some of those system-wide costs. So that's what we want to focus on and improve. These costs can get level down to very, very precise levels of kind of equipment and specific instances. The Natick versus Springfield example that Jen alluded to before, we want to make sure we're compensating things according to where they are. And this is important because the avoided and deferred costs, as that term has been introduced, and we'll keep throwing it about, can vary significantly, as well as those bridge to wires and potentially flexibility benefits, down to the very feeder or transformer level, to just name a couple pieces of equipment or nodes really on the distribution system. The costs of very wide range, both across and within individual electric systems, some being extremely expensive or extremely valuable in high need areas. And others, there's kind of a long tail where, hey, there's not really that much need right now that DERs can supplant or avoid. And so the benefits are relatively negligible. I have kind of two contrasting pictures in the charts here. On the left, you have all the way back in 2014, so we're now a decade past that, and it's moving much more into the granularity. But even then, kind of recognizing across many different utility service territories, there's a wide range of costs, even looking at largely averages. But on the graph at the right, you can see if you get down all the way to the feeder level, and this is from an example utility out west, you can see those costs range from thousands of dollars per kilowatt year, which is a unit that's often used in these analyses, down to the tens and single digit values. Ultimately, this is really important because this does eventually translate into kind of the more familiar dollar per kilowatt hour units that customers see on their bills. So if these costs can be avoided, that's ratepayer savings that can be found. But you can also see it's usually beneficial to drill down to the location-specific impact, because you don't want to be giving a DER the value for that $1 feeder versus the $2,500 on the other end of the scale. You want to make sure that you're isolating and maximizing the benefit possible and compensating accordingly. So just briefly, I'm going to go into the range of the value, but at any specific given point in time, much of the distribution grid won't be constrained. There won't be stress everywhere. But there's going to be small pockets, especially where load is growing, or there's some customer buys 2 new EVs for their house and they're on a small local transformer. Suddenly there's significant value in alleviating even that kind of small amount of strain or stress on the grid. But even where those DERs might not be able to meet the entire need permanently, this last bullet here really talks about that flexibility point that Jen had mentioned back in the EDC presentation. There is still potentially some benefit of meeting needs for a number of years, or just having kind of a broad value. But even if it's a limited time, we can get into those deferred and bridge to wires investments as well, when projects are known that expected that they're going to materialize, or they're impending at this point, and you really need that bridge to wires. You need something to deal with the need that's going to come next summer before you can actually get anything built. So actually capturing grid service value focuses a lot on the right place. I do also want to at least give a nod to the right time. We focused on the place because that distinguishes it from the system-wide value largely, though I think Andrew had also mentioned this before, that and we've talked about it in the EDC presentation and with the question from MK, that the timing matters. There's a couple different ways in which the timing matters. The one is kind of on the year-to-year level. We're talking about when the project is going to be built, how long you can defer it. But it also, we want to pay attention to timing as far as what the specific load profile is, or the timing within the day or within the hour of the year, when a specific need arises on the grid. We want to make sure that the DERs are actually able to provide generation or capacity resource during that same time. Sometimes they're well aligned with that system-wide average load. Other times it's very specific to whatever individual piece of distribution equipment you're focused on. To this end, dispatchable resources may be a focus of the studies. They're particularly well suited to provide this. Even better if they can be utility controlled to respond to other signals. But we do need to start to dive into this as we go through the steps of the study and understand kind of what kind of constraints from a program perspective or policies we want to set around this. We don't want to have it entirely focused necessarily in the long term on system-wide prices when the needs are going to be on an hourly basis based on your neighborhood or your business location. Then moving down kind of back into those broad questions into the point of having value be accessible. All of this focus so far has been on what determines value conceptually and for the grid, but the value must also be something that utility can realize in order to provide benefits to ratepayers. And while we'll continue to get into this more, I also want to call out a key component is understanding the benefits for environmental justice populations. And accessibility is important here too, because there's it's kind of another level on the conceptual and the difference in the benefits that arise, but also unlocking those benefits for all communities so that they can actually access them. So doing this, kind of unlocking the greatest portion of value does require some level of certainty for planning, especially when we're talking about even the bridge to wires, and the deferral benefits as well. Really having the utilities able to plan years in advance and know that they can defer or avoid investments. That's really important. They won't necessarily be able to do it if they've already started putting poles and wires up and kind of boots on the ground to start a project. Once they've hit that point, it can be a lot harder to come back and gain the maximum benefit from it. So it's really important to have some level of certainty there. If they can't count on it being there, then the investments can't necessarily be scoped or scheduled to provide those cost savings that we've been talking about. However, this also kind of implies that there's that flexibility benefit in simply knowing that a resource is going to be available. So even in the areas of the grid where we don't expect there to be a need right now, whether it's a car hitting a pole or whether it's just unexpected electrification, having participants enrolled in these programs and having those resources available and that information available to the utilities is very valuable. So that way we can kind of get it on paper and then get it incorporated in the planning and ideally actually call on that resource when it's needed. So as I mentioned, I can zoom back out again before we get too into the compensation discussion. It's pretty easy to get sidetracked and focused on that. As we talked about, there's many different sources of value that DERs provide. Distribution grid services doesn't exist in a vacuum. And along with the range of other grid services, there are additional and sometimes overlapping mechanisms to compensate all of those. This again has been mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, but I want to hone on it a little bit more as we dive into kind of compensating. Because when it comes to compensating grid services, we want to make sure we're aware of everything else that's going on so that the level of compensation is both fair and gives the right signals so that we can make the most out of all those DERs to satisfy the sometimes even kind of conflicting values that we're seeing from the rest of all the kind of system-wide grid services. So the compensation design itself is going to have to balance competing goals in terms of policy and ultimately be actionable. Programs might be able to provide value and be funded by all ratepayers, but this is effectively going to, or it's ultimately going to affect electric rates. It may shift costs between participants and non-participants, and we want to make sure, even if we're not entirely avoiding that, we want to make sure we understand it so we can avoid it to the degree necessary and make sure it's fair or it's serving a greater purpose. We don't want to have Paul pay for Peter's new solar system and not get any benefit from it or anything like that. We want to manage that shift and make sure that things stay affordable for everyone. We also want to encourage customer participation, which can sometimes be at odds with that because we actually have to have the program be appealing and want Peter to sign up and actually be able to provide any value to the grid. We also need to make sure that covers ultimately the cost of administering the program for the ratepayers. And finally, as a third very broad category, we want to make sure we're maximizing the value that can be realized, not just for the grid, but for the wider community. Those non-rate impacts mentioned prior really are talking about the societal benefits that might be realized, whether it's climate impacts, more breathable air, or specific equity considerations as we're getting into. And then finally, if that's not challenging enough, we have to make sure it's all actionable as we're addressing these three goals. We want the program to be simple enough for participants and investors to understand and want to participate in, as well as for administrators to actually implement. We want everybody to be able to do their job in a reasonable manner and cost effectively as well. So we have to balance all of this. So kind of translating all of this in a broadly step by step for our eventual roadmap, we kind of start with the value stacking, understanding and broadly valuing things in an appropriate context. We already discussed the cost shifts. So I won't go more into those bullets, but it is important to recognize. Second point, tied to the first, but really our overarching goal is all those policy objectives and outcomes. We want to make sure that every step that any compensation framework or program is actually driving towards those outcomes and that it's measurable and we are measuring that progress and making sure we stay aligned with it. Third is that ease of implementation tied to kind of making the program actionable from the administrative standpoint. And then finally, we also want to have clear market signals to make sure participants are able to actually invest in the program and react to the system and societal needs in the best way possible. So this is already a lot to digest, and there's going to be many more details we'll get into in the following months, and much more to consider. Thankfully, I just want to mention we're not starting entirely from scratch. There's the work done by MassDC, the EDCs, and all the other partners. Calling out in this slide just to the report put together by Bring Partners earlier this year. We'll be relying heavily as well on you as stakeholders for your input and helping us to understand your priorities as we get into this. Finally, before we jump into the stakeholder session and hearing directly from you, I do want to queue up one hugely important piece for all of this again, and that's the equity and environmental justice aspect. We really want to ensure both from the start and throughout the work that we're integrating consideration of equity and environmental justice into the analysis and program design itself. And from past experience, there are many things we've learned about how programs like these can impact equity. Some of it works and some of it doesn't work, but there's much more to ask and to learn. For example, low-income customers and renters are often less able to participate in some of these programs. So even on occasions where they're designed with a focus or carve out for them, it's not always enough. We want to make sure we're both in having this program be set up so it won't adversely impact anybody who isn't participating, and also that we're considering what else goes into accessibility beyond simply saying that everybody can sign up or even differentiating incentives. There's always more to it. But asking the right questions and finding those answers is going to involve a lot of work with you as stakeholders and potentially other parties as well. So we want to ask those questions and make sure we're getting to the right ones. Posing some of those questions on this slide. We're going to move shortly to the stakeholder input and question session. But we just want to talk about how grid services can provide direct benefits to environmental just communities, reduce their energy burden, how we can measure the benefits and value specific to those communities as it might be varied compared to the other parts of the distribution system or system-wide benefits. We want to talk about barriers to entry for participation, trying to find ways to overcome those, and also acknowledging them where they exist, because this may be a means or a situation where sometimes we can't fully overcome those barriers, and we want to make sure that the program is designed accordingly so it's not going to hurt anybody because they have that barrier in place. And then finally, and more broadly, what are the right channels to share knowledge and gather the perspectives of the impacted communities, both now, today, and as we're going through this workshop, and as we continue to move along and actually implement those programs, make sure they're kind of performing as intended and meeting the right inputs. So a key tenet of all this is having equitable participation as well from all impacted populations. So we don't want to be ascribing priorities or values secondhand, and we need all of your input. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to RMI for the stakeholder input session.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew. So we have the next 30 minutes or so to ask to have folks ask and potentially respond to some of the questions. Others we may acknowledge, especially if it's part of a larger discussion. We may just acknowledge them as input and incorporate them into planning future workshops or potentially into the methods and approach themselves. And I just want to reiterate that we really value your input and feedback and want to be sure that the approach, as Andrew just described, and that the ultimate results are really reflective of the priorities that of the stakeholders who this work will impact. And so what I'd like to do is to actually break this next section into two pieces. With the first, we'll focus on sort of clarifying questions and reactions to what was just presented. And then we'll transition into soliciting some more about your all's priorities and concerns associated with this work. So with this first prompt, yeah, feel free to throw it up there. Just in terms of what is not clear or what needs further clarification, I want to note that there's several questions in the chat, and some have been responded to in real time by the project team, which has been great. Others, I just want to call up here and see if we, amongst the project team, can respond to some of these. So the first I'm seeing is from Regine, who's asking, to what extent is addressing interconnection bottleneck part of this analysis and implementation plan? Does someone want to give a brief response to that one?
I can at least start there. I think it's something we want to be exploring. I think that you know, the challenge with anything that winds up at a compensation mechanism is figuring out sort of what the, you know, what like the value is that you can attach to something like that. And so, you know, that's going to be one of the tricky pieces, not just for thinking about interconnection bottleneck, but then certain other benefits that we'll identify as well. So, you know, we certainly welcome more thoughts there, but I'll say that, you know, it's absolutely on our minds as something that we want to be thinking about and you know, trying to figure out a way to include here. So if you've got further thoughts on it, we'll be eager to hear those. Otherwise, we'll be putting our minds to it as well.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And the next one is from Kent. Is the consideration of having a distribution system operator function within scope here, i.e. adding a layer between the end customer and the distribution transmission interface? Either E3 or Mass CEC want to provide some perspective on that one?
Yeah, happy to jump in again. I think this is a tricky question. I'm sure the EDCs have thoughts on it as well, since they are the de facto distribution grid operators. So I think the real question is there any function that we identify that basically cannot be served by the EDCs? And sort of, I think out of scope for this will be defining, you know, if the EDCs are or are not sort of like the appropriate servers of that function. I think, you know, the most that we're biting off to do in this project is to identify sort of, you know, what the needs are there, and then exactly how those, you know, exactly sort of like who is fit to do those is, you know, that's a more politically fraught question and one that I think is, you know, better in other realms.
Great, thanks, Andrew. And EDCs, do you want to chime in on that one? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. So I agree with what Andrew is saying, and it's a great question. So I go back in my head to the illustrative diagram that Jen had up. So where there was, you know, relationship between grid constraints and the things that we need to do 24/7 from a control room perspective as the electric distribution companies, and the way that we want to be able to compensate customer DER for the grid services that they provide. So I think we're like the term DSO like attaches like lots of you know, varying definitions, and people have different ideas of what that means, and sometimes it feels scary or different. But I think from our perspective, like we're exploring what sorts of capabilities we need to develop as an EDC in order to make like this image a reality, whether or not like we're attaching like different types of terms to it and terminology. Like I think it's really more so about understanding what capabilities we need to be able to operate flexibility more actively on our network and be able to use it for distribution grid services. So, and we feel like that's squarely in like EDC purview. So yeah, we're actively working on that and looking for this study to help inform that as well.
Great. Thanks, Eli. Russ, the next question I see in the chat is from you, but I also see your hand raised. Do you want to just come off mute and ask?
Sure. My question actually is to build on what was just said regarding distribution system operator. Why don't we call them the DSO program administrators? Because I think in the near term, you're going to have to use some type of compensation mechanism that goes beyond traditional billing mechanisms and rates that we have recently updated for both the National Grid and Eversource. So I think for near-term compensation, it's going to be a check that's paid outside of the utility bill to compensate for earned distribution services, much like Mass Save operates. So if we want to call them program administrators for DSO, then maybe that's the way we begin to migrate in that direction somehow. But I think realistically, that's what we're looking at. What was the next question that I asked? I asked a lot. I apologize. Was it
Yes,
about how we're going to pay?
You asked one about rates.
Yeah, that's really how are we going to pay? So
Yeah.
kind of building off of my comment I just made. What are the schemes for payment that you're considering? So one would be to somehow reflect compensation and tailored utility bills for a customer that's providing distribution services. The other would be through a parallel payment that doesn't go through the monthly utility bill. And I think that's probably the more likely one in the near term. I just wanted to see what you were thinking about so far. What's the incoming hypothesis regarding how compensation is made?
Russ, this is Gideon Banner from National Grid. Let me just see if I understand your question, because I could take it to mean two different things. I think I know which one it is, but I want to be sure. One is, are you asking about where the funds used to pay customers who participate would come from? You mentioned them not coming from rates. So that's where I got a little confused. Or do you mean whether the compensation comes on a customer's bill or separately from their bill in a separate payment? Is it the latter?
Yeah, it's the latter. How is the compensation payment made? We can discuss the source of funding, which I think is going to be socialized by all ratepayers.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I got confused by your use of the term rates, because usually in the EDCs, when we think of rates, we think of rate payers, but you're speaking about bill or non-bill compensation, I think, just to maybe use terminology.
Mixed it up a little bit, Gideon. Maybe I was confusing.
Sure. No, I understand. Yeah, it's there.
One way you could compensate somebody is through a new rate or overlay rate provision that reflects distribution service values provided. And that could be a new line item on a customer bill. I just don't see Eversource or National Grid going through a new rate case to add that provision on in the near future or getting that done quickly. So I'm assuming that the expedient option is provide a parallel form of compensation, like a check or a rebate or something on some periodic basis for services rendered.
Yeah, just speaking for National Grid, I mean, we have asked this question of ourselves. I mean, I think we're hoping to sort of fry other fish first, if you will, right before we get to payment structures. We really want to figure out the value for providing, as this study is trying to do, what is the value for providing these services, and what is the appropriate program structures, and then maybe we can then address how payment is rendered. But it is something we certainly have discussed. I can't speak for Eversource or Unitil, but I know it's come up for us at National Grid for sure. And interested to hear your input.
You have to figure out the value before you can determine how to pay, right? So that's logical. Makes sense.
Did you have another question? I'm sorry. I believe maybe we...
I have lots of questions, but I'll let somebody else go next.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Sounds good.
Thanks, Russ. So the next one I see in the chat is from Jacqueline. Is the E3 2035 distribution grid cost impacts driven by transportation electrification study with Grid Lab a good preview of the potential assessment methodology? Andrew, do you want to quickly respond to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an option for for how we would go about things. I think we're, we don't want to just take what we've done elsewhere and assume that that can perfectly apply here. So much of what we're able to do, especially in the now and the near term, is just dependent on the data that we've got available to us. And so we're still working with the utilities to figure out exactly what data we're able to have in front of us, and therefore what we have to work with. I think the methodology that you point to in that work with Grid Lab is one that we like, and that we've applied versions of elsewhere though. So I think it's certainly a good starting point. But I'm not going to say that we're going to exactly do that or anything.
Great. And Jacqueline, I noticed your hand up earlier on. Was that your main question, or is there another one that you wanted to ask?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we've gotten caught up from the outstanding questions in the chat, although if I've missed one, feel free to note that in the chat or coming off mute. So Andrew, if you click on the next couple of prompts here, I'm curious if there is any other initial feedback on what was presented in terms of the study objectives and goals, and any reflections on the approach and proposed methods that were presented today. And maybe specifically, are there important elements or considerations that seem missing from what was presented today? And so if folks, again, welcome folks to raise their hand and come off mute, or if you'd like to respond in the chat, that works as well. Okay, one from Jennifer. What do you see as the role of AI in this now or in the future? As an example, peak shaving or load shifting. Anyone want to respond to the AI question?
I'll maybe throw in a first thought there.
Sure, go ahead.
Which, I think, at least as I see it, the role of AI or any technology in terms of peak shaving and load shifting is, that's sort of like on the DER side of things. Our focus right now is on determining the value of a shifted or a reduced megawatt to the system, right? And that value ought to be indifferent to the technology that's providing that reduction or that shift. And so at least in terms of like how we're thinking about valuation, and I would say even how we're thinking about compensation, I don't see AI playing into that much. I think more so, as you start to think about aggregation of DERs, and maybe as we get into like forecasting, maybe there's some role for AI there, but I in my mind, that's all sort of to be seen and a little bit independent of like the value determination. But it's certainly a place where I think there are groups working on the AI side of this to figure out ways to sort of get deeper reductions, more reliable load shifting. I think that's all a really important piece of this, because that's how we get the most out of this process.
And maybe unnecessarily, but I do want to just emphasize that first point that Andrew Benedictus made, that we want it to be largely technology agnostic, and kind of leave that up to the participants to find the best way to meet the needs that are identified.
Great, thanks both. Russ, I see your hand again. Feel free.
Yep, so I'm ready to engage, Andrew. So you said that you believe the value is primarily the deferred, the value of deferred investment. So essentially, you're willing to attribute the interest cost, but not the capital cost, if you will, to the value of the services being provided. So rather than giving me compensation as a capacity resource, you're just going to give me the interest rate or time value of money value of deferring that asset investment by the utility out several years. And so fundamentally, I think you should be allowing these DER assets that are providing a service to capture the full value of service, not just the time value of money on the service. And that's where we fundamentally disagree. I agree that most utilities have made that argument regarding DER value across the country to date. And I just think fundamentally that it is wrong, or a great way for the utilities to look at it that disadvantages the DER asset owner. So I hope we can have a robust discussion around that with the EDCs as we engage in this effort. And if we want to tee that up specifically, I'm happy to do that and model out, show pictures, do what is ever needed to show the difference. The other thing that the utilities have sometimes pushed back on is that, yeah, well, we can't give you full value because we don't control your asset. And so we don't know if it's actually going to be there to provide that capacity value when the capacity peak is actually reached and that capacity is needed. So as a result, we can't compensate you for that. Well, that's just a probability analysis. And frankly, that applies to whether you provide me just the interest value or the full capital value of that solution. So it's kind of a red herring, regardless of how you look at it. And it's something like when ISO New England's forward capacity market, we have an effective load carrying capacity. You can do something similar on the distribution side on a probability basis. And frankly, it's something that the utilities do on the load side as well, looking at coincident loads when designing the grid, and non-coincidence factors associated with multiple customers on a circuit or a segment or a transformer or a secondary transformer, right? So it's not a concept that's new and different. It's just one that they've used as an argument against providing value to DER distribution services. So anyways, I look forward to engaging that discussion. I'm glad we're having it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that's super helpful, Russ. And you bring up such a valuable point, which is sort of like the utility view of dependability versus the DER operator or owner view of like what sort of dollars are needed to create dependability or create a response. And so that balance, that's exactly the sort of discussion that we want to be digging into. So yeah, super happy to have you bringing that up, and I agree that that's something we really want to engage in and figure out how we can basically create a system that does allow for that sort of full valuation, because that full valuation is real and is not going to show up on ratepayer in ratepayer dollars later. So that's the dream, right? Is to be able to defer those full capital costs or avoid, those full capital costs.
Great. Thanks both. Let's go to Sean, whose hand is up.
Great, thanks, and thanks for starting this conversation. Really excited to dig in on grid services in the Commonwealth and keep developing this concept here. Interested in kind of what your and the study team is thinking in terms of whether we're attempting to drive development of resources in response to the signals of grid services here, or if we're trying to change the behavior of resources under development or that are already in operation, or if we're trying to do both, because I think those are very different considerations for kind of what compensation is required and the reliability of that compensation over a longer period. So probably not an answerable question at this point, but that's one that I'm super interested in as working for a developer of clean energy resources.
Thanks, Sean, and for bringing that up. That's something that we've started to discuss already within the study team, and we'll definitely continue to discuss at length. Though appreciate you raising it now. I think maybe it'll be a mix of both, and we'll have to see really what we can really come up with to to find something that can either address both or whether there's some sort of split solution. I do want to just call out that as far as kind of encouraging new investment, another thing that we'll be certainly paying attention to is the overlap and really how it fits within the context of other compensation mechanisms and how we can use this as kind of an added signal for new investment when there might be other sources, and maybe we can't put all of the value in one bucket, but if there's enough that this could be really the piece that kind of tips the or drives the needle, I guess, tips the lever on getting that compensation where we need it and when we need it, then that would be hugely helpful. But thank you for raising it, and it's certainly top of mind for us.
Great. Andrew, if you wouldn't mind clicking through to the next slide. Perfect. So yeah, I think I'd like to transition from some of the clarifying questions and feedback on and reactions to what was presented into just more hearing from folks on the call. What are your top priorities from your perspective that you would like to see incorporated into this work? And related to that, what are your top concerns? And so actually, if you click one more, Andrew, sorry, I know my animations can be annoying. So yeah, would love folks to think on these two questions for a moment, and then feel free to either come off mute and raise your hand or list responses into the chat. Russ, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks. So, my top concern or my goal, I guess, that I hope for is to come up with a robust method to value distribution services for DER. I think that's a very important task for the Commonwealth at this point as we try to evolve policy in our grid. My concern is that the utilities will prevail at the PUs, at the Department of Public Utilities, and counter that either there is no value if they can't control it, or that value is already being compensated through other mechanisms. So we don't have to compensate it additionally as a distribution utility, because through some other ratepayer funded mechanism, those assets are already being compensated. So for example, the SMART program is compensating solar assets that are providing energy and other services to the grid and environmental attributes. And the utilities largely consider all of that value to be bundled together in exchange for a SMART incentive payment. So they would likely argue that there's no need to pay solar resources anything more. They're already being fully compensated. So that's an argument I can hear the utilities making. I think another argument I hear the utilities making or have made in the context of the wholesale distribution tariff discussion for standalone front of the meter batteries. We asked the utilities what value they thought that energy storage, large energy storage projects connected to the distribution grid was providing to the distribution company, given that we were likely, as we primarily focused on ISO New England markets for compensation, also suppressing peak demand on the utility circuit or feeder or substation, and providing similar benefits, and also perhaps providing load when there's low load or minimum load on a grid, and that it could provide that. Again, the utilities came back first saying, hey, we value none of it if we can't control it. And then secondly, they said, oh, wait, you're already being compensated for that through the Clean Peak program. Therefore, you deserve no additional compensation. So we received both of those arguments, neither of which really holds water for me, or at least from my perspective. And so that's my concern, is we come up and we have a robust discussion around how to calculate the value, but then the utilities will find a way to quash the value when it comes to representing it to the DPU, essentially pulling the rug out from any compensation schemes that we develop to encourage the growth and participation of DER. Thank you.
Thanks for the comments, Russ. I do want to just jump in and say we are really focused on that discussion portion and making sure that we're hearing all these perspectives. I certainly don't want to erase or pretend that there aren't differences in perspectives or opinions across the many, many parties that we are hoping to have involved in this discussion. But I just want to kind of emphasize that we intend for this to be an open discussion and appreciate you sharing those thoughts and want to continue that from all parties and don't want it to kind of quash any discussion, whether there's fears of some eventual outcome or another. We do want to have an honest and earnest conversation between all of this. So appreciate you airing those and want to make sure that we're kind of continuing that conversation throughout.
Yeah, I guess, my concern is we put in a lot of effort, Andrew, and it comes to naught. And it becomes a useful academic exercise that goes nowhere. So maybe that's really my ultimate concern. Thanks. And therefore, how much time should I really dedicate to doing this to come up with a robust argument for DER value?
Thanks for your comments, Russ. And yeah, we'll remind folks that there will be avenues to get us your feedback and thoughts after this workshop as well. So if thoughts are percolating for folks and you're someone that would prefer to communicate afterwards, we really welcome the feedback then as well. I do see Jackie's hand up. Or Jacqueline. Sorry, I don't know if you could my Jackie.
Thanks. One overall item that feels like it's important is, like if you look at the UK and how they're dealing with, flexible connections and flexibility first, a lot of it springs from the performance-based rate making structure that the utilities work with there. And I recognize there's some version of that in Massachusetts, but like the CapEx, OpEx, TOTEX structure seems to put the utilities in such a position that everything that we're talking about here is a very natural part of the way that they work and the way that they're compensated. And so I guess I'm curious if we see signs that point to utilities need to be compensated differently to be able to substantively engage with the types of structures you're talking about, like could we come out with proposals like that from this study?
I do think that broadly, just to take a stab, that's going to be a little bit beyond the scope of what we're focusing on here. We're focused more on kind of the grid services value. I definitely appreciate that context and that there is kind of broader, bigger questions to also be had. But I do think we'll try to chew off or take the bite off that we can and actually try to manage within this focus of the work. That said, I don't want to speak for Mass EUC, DER, with EDCs, any of the parties as far as where that goes. But within the scope of this work, we're going to be focused a little bit more on just kind of this specific element of distribution grid services and how it relates to DERs and their compensation.
Okay. I think, the reason that it came into my head is because these are grid services that, as the discussion has been showing, are so specifically focused on capital investment that it seems like stepping back and looking at the structure into which these services would be inserted it's related to the discussion that you were just having with Russ, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, I can add that I think just following up on Andrew's comment, like I think that the broader discussion of incentives and rates is too big for just this group and just this group of stakeholders. But from my perspective, at least, we're approaching this from the lens of how can we create and operate the most cost-effective, clean, and resilient electric system possible. So this grid services study is one small piece of contributing to that vision. So I think I agree that it's important, and we are thinking about this effort in the context of broader efforts like the IRWG, but just for the purposes of what we can accomplish in these meetings, we're kind of limited by time and the people in the room. But I do really appreciate that comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Great. Other reflections on priorities or concerns of folks. I think specifically want to ask if there's any in relation to some of the equity and environmental justice impacts that Andrew posed at the end of his section. And Andrew, even if you wanted to actually flip back up to some of those questions, I'd be curious if there's any reactions out there to any of these questions in terms of how they ought to be incorporated into this work.
Thanks for calling back to the spread. And I also want to just add on, it's not up here explicitly, but tied to that question of what are the right channels to share knowledge and gather perspectives. Even if the parties on this call may not be if we may not have everybody on the call that needs to be, we would also certainly appreciate kind of your effort and sort of crowdsourcing to bring those perspectives in. We'll send out these slides and some additional materials afterwards if you hadn't already received the primer, for example, and there's the link to our website. On that website, there's a form to sign up for these meetings, and we can also have our contact information, or we do have our contact information included. So we want to focus on that discussion here to what extent we can, but also want to open it up and recognize that if there's other parties that should be present and called upon, really, we want to include them as well. So appreciate kind of your assistance in that manner as we're continuing to reach out.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Darian, I see your hand there.
Hey, Brett, thanks. I'm in between meetings, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm on my cell phone. I would just
we hear you
advocate, great. I would advocate for the role of a landlord in a environmental justice community, not just because I work at wind companies, we manage a lot of properties, but because I've seen the potential, I think, for landlords to really engage meaningfully in load shifting and capacity programs in ways that we're piloting now with DOE. And I'd like to see more of landlords, own the heat pumps or the end appliance within units. And there's a lot of potential to engage as technologies continue to change. And also landlords are responsible for providing adequate heating during the winter. So, any load response that really impacts landlord's responsibility from a code perspective needs to be considered. And I just think, when we think of environmental justice communities and individually metered multifamily, the landlord really has to be front and center, helping to coordinate load reduction and flexibility.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Darian. And I'm curious if there's examples of programs or pilots that you all have participated in, if I can ask a follow-up, that have demonstrated the ability of landlord coordinated load response to then be able to share benefits with tenants. Is that something that you've seen?
I'm not familiar with any explicitly, but I think that could be a worthwhile point to explore for sure.
Yeah, got it. Great. Thanks. Great. Well, we are nearing the closure. I guess if you click to the last two questions there, Andrew, I think, other areas, especially looking forward, that we'd love input and feedback on and will help, I think, shape the approach and communications around this work are to think about the various outcomes that folks would like to see from their perspective and what does success look like from your perspective if this, if this assessment of what the correct values are, and then a compensation mechanism were to be designed and implemented, what is a successful, what do the success metrics related to those steps look like from the various perspectives represented on this call? Would be great things that we'd love to hear about. And again, there will be multiple avenues to hear about them, so we really welcome input after this workshop. So I'll just pause a moment to see if there's any last thoughts or questions now from participants. And otherwise, I think we can move on to the closing slides, and we'll highlight those future avenues of communication. Excellent. So as Andrew mentioned earlier, this is the first of 4 workshops related to this study. The second, a date has not been set for the second workshop yet, but we're anticipating that it will be somewhere in the February timeframe. And we will aim to lock in that date and send out notice via the email list well in advance. So again, if you're not on the list yet and would like to be, please, you can go to the Mass CEC site and get yourself on the mailing list. There's also a link in these slides. And in that February workshop, the idea will be to dig down a few layers deeper into the weeds and discuss sort of the detailed analytical approach to grid services valuation. And there will be likely some more data on hand at that point that the E3 team will be able to share out as well. So that'll be sort of the scope for that second workshop, and then looking ahead to spring for workshop 3 and early summer for workshop 4. Thanks, Sarah, for putting the link into the chat there. Okay, next slide, please. So again, yeah, the future meeting announcements will be sent out by email. The slides and recording from this session will be made available on the website, which also contains general information about the study, as well as the primer that was developed on for ahead of this workshop. You are welcome to share questions or additional feedback via the emails listed here. And then Maya just linked a form, which is an additional avenue for feedback, in the chat. It will also be emailed to everyone who registered for the webinar or for this workshop today, and then will also be posted on the Mass CEC site. So highly encourage and welcome additional thoughts via those platforms as well. And with that, I think we can conclude and stop the recording. So thank you all very much for joining. And if there are any additional items that folks that are